Episode 60, The Late Night Delivery. It was a period in time where finding a job was as hard as it had ever been. For a lady named Addie, she was not only out of a job, but her savings had been heavily depleted from helping her family members survive. So, one day she decided to start a bakery business from home and promote her pastries online. The business gradually picked up, and Addie did whatever she could to make it convenient for her customers. So, Addie would deliver her pastries right to her customers' doorsteps, even if it meant that she had to make deliveries late into the night. Late into the night, where she had an encounter that she would never forget. So, it was a Thursday afternoon, and Addie was preparing the pastries she needed to deliver that same night. While doing so, she received a text message for an order that requested to have the pastries for a party later on that would stretch till the early hours. She thought about the delivery schedules and realized that if she were to deliver the latest order by tonight, it would be way past midnight since the location was a distance away. But seeing that it was a pretty large order which would pay her well, and knowing that her rent was due in a few days, Addie decided to push on. Addie let her customer know that the order will be done and delivered to her by later that night. Addie continued baking her pastries, and after she was finally done, she realized that it was already 11 p.m. There were 3 houses that she needed to deliver to before she could proceed for the final delivery. Addie quickly packed all her pastries and hurried out of her apartment. One after another, Addie rushed on her motorbike and managed to deliver to the 3 houses in quick time. Addie was glad that the homes were close to her, as all the deliveries were completed right at the stroke of midnight. Addie now had only one delivery left. The apartment was a good 10 miles from where she was. Addie hopped on her motorbike and drove across the highway before eventually arriving about a half hour later. It was now almost close to 1 a.m. The security officer opened the gantry, and Addie drove right to the apartment building. Addie looked at her mobile phone to confirm the address. From there, she remembered that the apartment that she needed to do her final delivery was on the 10th story. Addie checked the pastries again to make sure that all was in order and headed to the lift lobby. While waiting for the elevator, Addie's adrenaline from all the rush that night suddenly disappeared. Addie realized how silent it was, and the stress she felt from trying to make sure that she gets all the orders delivered was gone. But Addie didn't feel at all calm. Instead, there was a sense of eeriness in the atmosphere. Addie looked around and saw no one else in sight. The air was unusually cold that night. But right when Addie was caught in her own thoughts, the elevator door opened. She entered and pressed the button for the 10th floor. It would take a little bit of time, so Addie looked back down on her phone to see the text messages she hadn't had the time to reply to, as she had been in a rush since afternoon. Addie glanced up to look at the elevator screen, which showed the story she was currently on. It showed the 6th story. Addie noticed how slow the elevator was moving and just stared at the screen. Story by story, the elevator slowly went up. Finally, the elevator arrived on the 10th story. The door opened. Addie quickly got out and saw the signs on the elevator lobby wall, which showed the directional signs to the unit number that she needed to go to. Addie turned left and walked along the common corridor. As she was walking, Addie looked at the door of the apartment she passed by to know if she was approaching the correct apartment number. She looked and saw that the unit number was 138. The unit number she wanted to head to was 140. So Addie knew that the unit was only 2 apartments away. But that was when Addie realized something was odd. The unit number that she was looking at was 9138. This meant that she was on the 9th story. It confused Addie as she was sure that she had pressed the 10th story on the elevator button. Addie walked to the next apartment just to confirm, and the unit number showed as 9139. Addie now confirmed that she was on the 9th story. Addie walked back to the elevator lobby, and a board in between the two elevators showed that Addie was indeed on the 9th story. Not wanting to waste any more time, Addie brushed it off, thinking that maybe she was too tired that she might have pressed the wrong story button. So Addie climbed the stairs, which were right next to the elevator lobby, and shortly after, she arrived on the 10th story. Addie walked along the corridor, and this time around, she was right. She walked past 2 apartment units before eventually arriving at the correct unit, 10140. It was almost 1 a.m. now, but Addie was glad she made the delivery while her customer's party was still going on strong. Addie handed over the pastries, thanked her customer, and left. Addie walked back to the elevator, pressed the button, and the elevator soon arrived. Addie got into the elevator and pressed the button for the 1st story. Addie looked down at her phone to kill time, as she thought about how tired she felt and couldn't wait to get back home to have some sleep. Addie looked back up and noticed that the elevator wasn't moving. Addie pressed the button again, and that was when she realized that the elevator was faulty. Addie exited the elevator and saw that the other elevator was not working as well. So as to not waste any more time, a worn-out Addie walked down the stairs. And after 2 flights of stairs, Addie thought she had arrived on the 9th story. Addie looked up, and to her surprise, the sign showed that she was still on the 10th story. Addie rubbed her eyes as she thought that she was that tired that she wasn't seeing well. Addie looked again and still saw the sign that showed the 10th story. This was when Addie knew that something was wrong. She began to realize that the eeriness she felt when she first arrived at the apartment was no coincidence. Even when she got off the elevator earlier on the 9th story, Addie was sure that she pressed the button for the 10th story. Addie didn't have a choice. Even though she was starting to feel afraid, she really wanted to go home. So instead of going back to the customer's home to seek help, Addie went down the stairs again. She looked at the elevator lobby, and again, she saw that the sign was on the 10th floor. Addie was starting to feel slightly panicked. Addie was tired, and as she took out her phone to call a friend to seek help, she heard giggles coming from the staircase area. She turned and saw a head pop back in and hid behind the walls. It was as though someone or something was observing her all along. Addie immediately felt goosebumps on her forearm, and as she was starting to feel terrified, as her trembling hands tried to search for her friend's phone number to give her a call. That was when Addie heard the giggling get louder and louder. Then, Addie saw a tall, black-clothed figure, whose head touched the ceiling, slowly walk down the stairs from above and walk towards Addie. There was no face, no eyes, just a shadow beneath the black cloth and hood. All Addie could see was a grin in bright red. As it slowly approached Addie, she screamed and stumbled back. Addie fell on her back and saw the ceiling above her. Addie sat up, and nothing was there. No giggles, no black-clothed figure. Addie was horrified at that point. Still seated on the floor, she took out her phone and called her friend. Addie pressed the number and held her phone close to her ear, but there was no sound. Addie looked at her phone, and of course it had to be. There was no signal on her phone. There was no way for Addie to call anyone. She had no choice. She had to go back to her customer's apartment for help. As she was still on the floor and still looking at her phone, Addie heard the giggling sound again. Addie looked up. It was the black figure again. This time it was on all fours, facing right at Addie. The red grin could still be seen, but as it was earlier, Addie could see no face on the figure. Addie was frozen scared. The black figure then crawled towards Addie as it giggled. Even though initially Addie was too scared to scream, after panting several times, she eventually shouted hysterically. Addie closed her eyes as she saw the black figure getting very close to her. Everything after that was a blank. Addie couldn't hear or see anything else. All she remembered was her customer coming out and helping her up. Addie was still traumatized, and the only thing she remembered after that was the security guard guiding her down to the first story and back to her motorbike. If she remembered correctly, the security guard did ask her what had happened, but Addie was too traumatized at that point in time to even respond. Addie could also barely hear what anyone said to her. All she could remember were the echoes of the giggling sound and the red grin of the black-clothed figure. Addie just remembered somehow that her friend, whom she tried to call earlier, came over eventually and drove her bike with Addie as the pillion. Her friend accompanied her for days to come as Addie slowly recovered from the haunting experience. But even so, every now and then, whenever she would do her deliveries at an apartment, she would remember the night where she experienced the unexplainable. And whenever Addie needed to do late-night deliveries, she would always get a family member or a friend to accompany her, so that she never again had to see the black-clothed figure.